Spinning Gears by Ryūnosuke Akutagawa. 1. Raincoats. I was on my way to Tokyo for the wedding reception of an acquaintance. Satchel in hand, I urged the taxi driver on toward a station on the Tokaido line from my home in a coastal resort town. Thick pine woods lined both sides of the road. We weren't likely to make the Tokyo-bound train. The other passenger in the cab owned a barber shop. He was plump as a natsume and wore a short beard. Concerned about the time, I still managed to respond to his occasional remark.
Strange. The things that happen. I hear they've been seeing a ghost on Mr. X's property. Even in the daytime.
Even in the daytime, eh? My response was half-hearted. I stared across to where the western sun struck a pine-covered hill.
Not on good days, though. Mostly when it rains. Maybe the ghost comes to get wet. That's funny, but I have heard it wears a raincoat.
Sounding its horn, the taxi pulled up beside the station. I took leave of the barber and went inside. The Tokyo train had in fact pulled out 2 or 3 minutes earlier. One person, a man in a raincoat, sat on the waiting room bench, blankly staring outside. I recalled the ghost story I had just heard, but gave the thought only a contorted little smile. I decided to wait for the next train in the cafe across from the station. Actually, cafe was too grand a name for this place. I sat at a corner table and ordered a cup of coca. The table was covered in white oilcloth with a rough grid of narrow blue lines, but the slick coating was worn away in spots, revealing the dingy canvas beneath. I took a sip of coca, which had a fishy, glue-like smell, and looked around the deserted room. On the grimy walls were slips of paper announcing the dishes available. Oyako donburi, pork cutlet, omelette with loco eggs. These paper slips seemed so typical of the countryside near the Tokaido line, where modern electric power locomotives pulled trains through fields of barley and cabbage. It was close to sunset by the time I boarded the next Tokyo train. I always rode second class, but this time I decided to take third class. The train was fairly crowded. I was surrounded by a group of elementary school girls on their way back from a swim at Oiso or some such place. I observed them as I lit a cigarette. They all seemed to be in a merry mood, and most of them jabbered on without a break. "Mr. Cameraman, what does love scene mean? It's English, isn't it?" Sitting across from me, the Mr. Cameraman in question, who had apparently accompanied the school outing, did his best to avoid a straight answer. But a girl of 14 or so kept prying him with questions. It suddenly occurred to me that her nasal whine might be due to an infection, and I couldn't help smiling. Then the girl next to me, who must have been 12 or 13, went to sit on the lap of the young lady teacher, hooking her arm around the woman's neck and stroking her cheek. Between remarks to her friends, she would say things like, "You're so pretty, teacher. You have such pretty eyes." As a group, they seemed to me more like women than schoolgirls, if you ignore the fact that some were unwrapping caramels or munching on unpeeled apples. But then the one I took to be the oldest girl must have stepped on someone's foot as she passed my seat. "Oh, do forgive me," she said. Oddly, her very maturity made her seem more like a schoolgirl than the rest. I couldn't help sneering at myself, cigarettes in my lips, for my own contradictory impression. Eventually, the train, in which the lights had come on at some point, pulled into a suburban station. I stepped down to the cold, windy platform, crossed the footbridge, and waited for the connecting train. At that point, I ran into T, who worked for a large company. While waiting, we talked about things such as the faltering economy. He, of course, knew a lot more about such matters than I did, but one of his most powerful-looking fingers bore a turquoise ring that had nothing to do with hard economic times. "That's quite a ring," I said. "This? Oh, a friend of mine made me buy it from him when he went over to Harbin on business. He's having a tough time, too. He can't deal with the cooperatives anymore. The train we boarded was, fortunately, not as crowded as the first one. T and I sat next to each other and kept on talking. He had just returned to Tokyo from an assignment in Paris this past spring, and so Paris tended to dominate our conversation. We talked about Madame Calais' shooting of the owner of Le Figaro, about crab cuisine, about an imperial prince who was traveling abroad. France is having surprisingly little trouble with the economy. The French really hate to pay taxes, though, so their cabinets are always falling. But the franc's gone through the roof. That's if you believe what you read in the papers. Over there, the paper will tell you Japan has nothing but earthquakes and floods. Just then, a man in a raincoat sat down across from us. This gave me an eerie feeling, and I wanted to tell T about the ghost story I had heard. But before I could do so, he tipped the handle of his cane to the left and, still facing forward, quietly said to me, "See that woman over there? The one with the gray woolen shawl? With the western hairdo? Uh-huh, and the clothes bundle. She was in Karuizawa this summer, always wearing chic western clothing." She certainly would have looked very shabby to anyone who saw her at the moment. However, I stole a few glances at her while talking with T. There was a hint of insanity between her brows, and protruding from her clothes bundle was a sea sponge with leopard-like spots. "I heard she was always dancing with some young American in Karuizawa. She's one of those modern whatchamacallums." When I said goodbye to T, I realized that the man in the raincoats had disappeared at some point. Bag in hand, I walked from the station to a hotel. Tall buildings lined both sides of the street. As I walked along, I thought about this morning's pine woods. I also realized that something strange had entered my field of vision, a set of translucent spinning gears. I had had this experience several times before, and it was always the same. The number of gears would gradually increase until half my vision of field was blocked. This would last only a few moments, and then the gears would vanish, to be replaced by a headache. My eye doctor had often ordered me to cut down on smoking to rid myself of this optical illusion, if that's what it was. But actually, I had begun seeing the gears before I turned 20, well before I started smoking. "Here it comes again," I told myself, and covered my right eye to test the sight of the left one. The left eye was fine, but behind the lid of the right several gears were spinning. I hurried down the streets as the buildings on the right side gradually disappeared. By the time I entered the hotel, the gears were gone, but the headache was still there. As I was checking my overcoat and hat at the desk, I decided to reserve a room. Then I telephoned the magazine publisher to talk about money. The wedding banquets had apparently long since started. I found a seat at the far corner of the table and began moving my knife and fork. There were more than 50 people seated at the U-shaped table, and all of them, from the bride and groom at the center on down, were naturally in high spirits. I, however, grew increasingly depressed beneath the bright lights. To escape this feeling, I tried chatting with my neighbor, an old gentleman with a white beard like a lion's mane. He was actually a famous scholar of Chinese whose name I knew. Our conversation soon turned into the classics. "The Kirin is, finally, a kind of unicorn," I said, "and the Who corresponds to the Western Phoenix." He seemed interested in my remarks, but the longer I sustained the mechanical process of making conversation, the more I began to feel a sick, destructive urge coming on. I declared that the legendary sage emperors Yao and Shun were, of course, fictional creations, and that the author of the Spring and Autumn Annals were actually a person of the much later Han period. At this, the China scholar made an open show of his displeasure. He turned away and, with a tiger-like growl, cut me off in mid-sentence. "If you start saying Yao and Shang never existed, you are making a liar out of Confucius, and that a sage would never tell a lie." I shut up then, of course, and began to slice the meat on my plate. I noticed the tiny maggots silently squirming on the edge of the meat. The maggots called to mind the English word worm. This was probably another word like Kirin or Hu, designating a legendary creature. I laid down my knife and fork and watched my champagne glass being filled. When, at last, the banquet ended, I walked down a deserted corridor to shut myself up in the room I had booked. The corridor struck me as more like that of a prison than a hotel, but fortunately my headache had subsided. They had brought my suitcase to the room, and my hat and coat as well. Hanging on the wall, the coat looked to me like my own standing figure. I hurriedly threw it into a corner wardrobe. Then I went to the mirror and stared at my reflection. My face in the mirror revealed the bones beneath the skin. Into the memory contained in this skull of mine leaped the vivid image of the maggot. I opened the door, stepped out, and wandered down the hall. In a corner where the corridor joined the lobby stood a tall lamp, its green shade brilliantly reflected against a glass door. The sight gave me a peaceful sensation. I sat in a nearby chair and mused on many things, but I was unable to remain seated there for as long as 5 minutes. There was another raincoat, this one dangling over the back of the sofa next to me where someone had tossed it. And this is supposed to be the coldest time of the year. Thinking this, I headed back down the hallway. At the bellboy station in a corner of the corridor, there was not a bellboy to be seen, though I could hear their voices. In response to some remark, one said in English, "All right." All right? I struggled to grasp the meaning of the exchange. All right? All right? What could possibly be all right? My room, of course, was silent, but the thought of going through the door I found unsettling. After a moment's hesitation, I steeled myself and went in. I sat at the desk, taking care not to look in the mirror. The seat was an armchair done in a green Moroccan leather, like a lizard's skin. I opened my bag, took out a sheaf of manuscript paper, and tried to work on a story I had been writing. But even after I had dipped it in ink, my pen would not move. And when at last it did, it just kept writing the same words over and over. All right. All right. All right, sir. All right. Suddenly the phone by the bed rang. Startled, I stood up and put the receiver to my ear. "Who is it?" I asked. "It's me." Me. It was my elder sister's daughter. "What is it? Is something wrong?" "Yes, something terrible," she said. It's so terrible. I called your house and Auntie told me to..." "Is it really so terrible?" "Yes, really. Please come right away. Right away." She cut the connection. I set the receiver down and pressed the button to summon a bellboy. My hand moved reflexively, but I was fully aware that it was trembling. No one came in response to the bell. More out of anguish than annoyance, I pressed the button again and again, understanding at last what fate was trying to tell me with the words, "All right." That afternoon, in a nearby Tokyo suburb, my sister's husband had been killed by a train. Despite the season, he had been wearing a raincoat. I am in that same hotel now, writing the same story. No one goes down the hall in the middle of the night, but sometimes I hear the sounds of wings outside my door. Perhaps someone is keeping birds nearby.